Okay. Okay. Coming back to Kant, Kant has just shown us that morality is the highest value, and that other things, while they might be very good in general, if you have to pick between a medium level good and a high good, you sure better choose the higher good. Okay. What Kant then points out, and this is the pages 32, 33, it's sort of scattered throughout the reading, is Kant says people often make this confusion. They think that morality is doing what you want, or doing something because it somehow works for you in some way. It's somehow good for you in some way. Another confusion that people make is they say that morality is about getting good consequences or actions from, or good consequences or results from your actions. So a lot of people mistakenly think, Kant says, a lot of people mistakenly think that something's good if it helps you get what you were trying to get out of it. That's what he means when he says following your inclination. Or he thinks that people make the mistake of thinking that something's good if the consequences, effects, or results that come out of it are good. So one place we see Kant saying why that can't be the case is page 34. Page 34, column A. Let me read this section. He says, effects of actions, such as something being agreeable or pleasant to your condition, and even the promotion of the happiness of other people, could have been brought about by all sorts of causes, including causes that don't need any will of a rational agent. And so this is his point. He says, morality has to do with human beings' dignity, which is found in our reason and our freedom or autonomy. Now, if morality were just about happiness, this is not what Kant thinks, but he's disagreeing with what others think. Others say morality is about happiness, whether for oneself or others. And Kant says, but anything can make you happy. So if a child finds a sucker on the ground, they'll pick it up and eat it and they'll be happy. So if morality is about happiness or pleasure or enjoyment, then any random thing in the world might cause happiness for somebody. A sucker for the child, finding a bunch of money on the ground for the greedy person, right? Kant's whole point, though, is that morality is not something the world does. Morality is not something that happens to a person. For something to be moral, it has to be something that a free person does, not something that happens to them. Not an accident in the world, but something chosen by a human being. So let's put it this way. If you see, there's a poor kid in your neighborhood and you want him to be happy, and you said, I bet if I just gave him a little piece of candy, they'd know that, like people are nice in the world and they'd feel good. That'd make the kid feel better. So you see the neighbor kid and you give him a piece of candy and they go, oh, hey, thanks, Mrs. Johnson, Mr. Johnson, that's great. Okay, now a lot of people would say why that's good is because you made the kid happy. But Kant would say morality is not a function of the kid enjoying the candy. Morality is a function of you choosing to do that because you think it's the right thing to do. You see what I mean? If the child just finds some candy and it makes them happy, the child's truly happy, and that's a good thing. But you wouldn't say them finding the candy is a moral event, right? No, it's good, but there's no morality to it because no one chose to do it. Now, if you choose to do something because you think it's the right thing to do and it makes the child happy, then it's moral. But Kant points out, okay, what's the difference here? The child got candy both ways. The child wanted candy both ways. And so the child was happy both ways in both scenarios. In one, though, we call it moral. when you chose to give something to the poor kid in your neighborhood. And the other one, we still say it's good, but we don't call it moral. It's not immoral either, right? It's just some other kind of thing. So he says, in the two scenarios, they're identical, except in one, a person chose to do something because they thought it was the right thing to do. And Kant says, look, we all know already. It's only when someone chooses with their will or autonomy to do something which they think is the right thing to do that you'd ever even think of calling an action moral. So let me give an example of my own to try to show this point in a little more clarity. Utilitarians, or lots of people in general, will say that actions are morally good when they benefit a bunch of people and don't hurt too many people. Okay? So what Kant would say in response, this is my example, but his kind of idea, is he'd say, well, the sun benefits lots of people. It benefits the whole human race because we wouldn't be able to eat without the sun, right? There'd be no food to eat. So he says, the sun benefits all of humanity. That's a lot of people. And it harms some. It might give some skin cancer, or it might, blind you when you first stumble out of the house after a wild night. Okay. But he says, he would say something like, overall, the sun does a lot of good for human beings, and it doesn't do us much harm. And I think we'd all agree on that, right? The sun is freaking great. But you would never think to call the sun a moral agent. Right? No matter how good it is, you'd never think to call it morality. The sun is not doing moral actions. Now, if a person somehow benefited all of humanity as much as the sun did, if they chose to do that because they thought it was the right thing to do, then we would call it moral. Kant's whole point here is that he says, look, if you'd never think of calling something moral except when there's a human willing to do something for a good reason, then even when humans choose to do things that benefit people, the only thing that can make that good is not the benefit, because the sun benefits us and we don't call it moral. It's got to be the inner movement of the person's autonomous freedom saying, I want to do this thing because I think it's the right thing to do. So consequences, results, the effects of your action, Kant says have no bearing, no relationship to morality whatsoever. I know that's hard to believe. But once more, he says, the simple situation is that many times there are positive effects to an action, and we don't call them moral. Because we know that there needs to be a free human being choosing to do something for it to even possibly count as moral. Now here's the flip side of the same exact point. Imagine that there's two lifeguards. So there's you and you're a summer lifeguard, and imagine that you have like an identical twin. Okay? And your identical twin is like you basically in every respect. They got the same lifeguard training as you did. They're just as strong and in shape as you are. They're just as smart as you are, everything. So you're working at a pool on the north side of the summer camp, right? And they're working at a pool on the south side of the summer camp. And at the same time, two kids fall into the pool. One kid falls into the deep end of your pool, and another kid falls into the deep end of the other pool. Now, they're twins too. What a crazy world this is. All these twins running around. The little kids who fall in the pool are twins too. So they sink to the bottom at the same speed. They have the same lung capacity. You see my point? Details aside, it's the same exact scenario. Okay, everything's identical. You and your twin respond with the same quick reflexes. You jump in the water. You swim well because you've got the same exact training. You pull your twin up, the kid drowning at the same time as your twin pulls up the other kid drowning. You both perform CPR in the exact same way, and both of you want to save the kid, of course, to the same exact degree. So you both pull the drowning kid up at the same time, perform the same CPR. One kid dies. One kid does not make it through. The other kid lives. Now, what would you say about this scenario? Would you say that both lifeguards are morally bad people? Probably not. Would you say they're both morally good people? Probably. They tried to do the right thing. But the consequences are different. In fact, the consequences in one case are good, the child survived, and in the other case, the consequences are bad, the child died. But Kant says, well, look, that's exactly the point. We do look when we're thinking clearly, and we should look when we're thinking about morality, not to effects or consequences, but to the what happened inside the person, basically. What did they want to do, and why did they want to do it? They want to save the kid because they're there to protect other people. So the effect or the consequence or the result of the action in the world, this example shows that's not where morality and immorality lie. It's in the motive of the person, why they did the action, not in the result. The sun is not moral no matter how nicely it warms up the world. A lifeguard who tries to save a life and wants to save a life but fails is not a murderer, right? They're not a bad person. Okay. Thus far, I've told you that morality is more important than other things. I've told you that morality has to consist in the person who does the act and their reasons for doing it. And mainly, we've also focused on, well, it can't be morality cannot be determined solely by effects, consequences, results of the action. But we haven't really said yet exactly, well, what does make something moral? I said if the person wants to do the good thing, then they're a good person. But you all should have caught me there and said, okay, you just defined morality as doing the right thing. Thanks, genius. That's not much of a definition when you say something's good because it's good. You see what I mean? And what you should say is, you've given us no content yet. You've said morality is not about these other things. And I've also said morality is higher than these other things. And I've given you sort of circular definition of saying morality is when someone does something for the right reasons, or when someone does something wanting to do the right thing. So basically I've said morality is when someone wants to be moral. And you all should be thinking, okay, there's not enough content yet to that. Here in a nutshell is what Kant says the content of morality is. Page 34, Kant says, morality will always be about following certain rules. Those rules will be universal. That means they'll apply to all people in the same way. So in any similar scenario, the same action is demanded or required of everyone. The rule, he says, needs to be what he calls duty, D-U-T-Y, or obligation. That is, you do it just because it's the right thing to do, not because you want to necessarily, and not because it benefits you in some way. So that's page 34. That's one big chunk of content for what Kant says morality is. He says morality is not about you picking to do something that particularly suits you, but you do it when it's something that you think everyone should do in that similar scenario. Morality is about following rules, moral rules and laws, not because it necessarily feels good, although it can, and not because you necessarily want to, even though you might, but just because it's the right thing to do. That's the first big chunk. And that's page 34 going over to 35. And we see that illustrated. Kant shows us on page 37. He says, the categorical imperative, which is his way of saying what morality has to consist of, the content of morality, is the categorical imperative, and you can phrase it as act only on that maxim or rule by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. A little lower down he says, act as if the maxim or moral rule of your action were to become by your will a universal law of nature. All he means by that, very odd phrasing, but all he means by that is moral rules are consistent. They apply universally to everybody. And that you don't get to carve out exceptions to moral rules for yourself because you don't like what it's going to do in this particular scenario. You don't get to carve out an exception to a moral rule because you don't feel like following it. Now here's the tension, right? Here's the difficulty. At one level, Kant says, and most of us would agree, is we know that. We know morality is not about doing whatever you personally want. We also know that, yeah, there's general rules in morality. Thou shalt not murder. That's a good one. You shouldn't steal stuff. That's a good one. Pretty consistent. But then a lot of us also say, yeah, but what if you're starving? Then are you allowed to steal? Or what about the death penalty? Is that murder or is that some other kind of killing? So we admit, most of us, that there are general rules we should follow in morality, but then we're concerned that there might be exceptions to those rules. Or we know that in general you should do what's generally morally required and not just whatever you feel like. But it's hard to tell sometimes what the actual general moral rule would be. So here's what I want to point out, though, is this seems like Kant has said something we've all heard before. Yeah, follow the rules, do what you're told, don't be selfish, etc. And we say, okay, yeah, I don't want to be selfish, I know that's immoral, but I don't know what I'm supposed to do in every scenario. And surely there sometimes have to be exceptions to every moral rule. And this is what Kant says around page 34. He says, I know it seems hard to always follow the moral rule, and I know it seems like it would be sort of impossible, that there always be an exception to the rule. But this is what he says. He says, if you want to base morality on the results or the consequences, and or if you want to base morality on, well, every situation's different, you have to look at the details of every situation, then what happens is you'll never be able to actually make a decision. Kant says, top of 35, he says, when you can't will that something should be a universal law, that is, when it doesn't make sense to you to say, I think everyone in this similar situation should do exactly what I'm saying I should do, then he says that if you do the other way, which is that you say, well, every situation's different, or, well, we have to wait and see what the consequences are to see if the action's good or not. He says you're leaving yourself at the mercy of the world with all its contingencies. Think about it. If every situation is morally different, then when you've got a girlfriend or boyfriend, you have to ask yourself, well, I don't know, is cheating acceptable in this situation? Do they think cheating's acceptable in this situation? What are the relevant circumstances? Maybe on Mondays the answer is different than it is on Sunday. Maybe I'm allowed to cheat with this person, but I wasn't allowed to cheat with my prior or my next significant other. You realize that would actually be a way crappier way to live and to do morality. Always waiting to see what the situation is. Always being subject to, well, it might change tomorrow. So this is part of the problem, is people go, well, morality always has gray areas, people always disagree, who knows? And then they throw up their hands and they do whatever they felt like doing. But Kant says, actually, it's only when you emphasize all the ifs and the buts and the whens and maybe this and maybe that, you've created a gray area where you didn't need to create one. If you just simply say, what's the generally right thing to do? I will do the generally right thing. It's a shortcut in a good way a shortcut to virtue. Because you don't have to sit there and calculate possible consequences. You don't have to sit there and ask other people what they think. You don't have to sometimes on Wednesdays act one way and on Friday figure out a reason why you have to act the opposite way. You just have a consistent code to your life. You apply it consistently. You explain it consistently. And you have a moral compass guiding you the same direction, true north, all the time. Now, most people instead want to say morality is a gray area. It depends on what I want. It depends on the circumstances. It depends on who I'm acting with. Then what happens is every time they have to figure out from scratch, as if they've never thought about the question before, should I lie in this scenario? Should I tell one friend one thing and tell another something different? Should I steal this time? How much should I steal? Right? People force the difficulty of morality on themselves by paying attention to things that don't actually matter. By zooming in on little details that simply aren't relevant to morality and trying to overcomplicate every situation. Now, I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction here. Okay? Kant says morality is just about the rules that you can make general, and you can say that I should do in this scenario and everyone else should do in this scenario too. Now, I'll say something here that Kant doesn't say, but I think it sort of brings this point home. We hear people say this all the time, that there's no single moral answer, that every situation's different, that there's gray areas, etc. Now, when do they normally say that? They say it often when they would benefit somehow from the moral rule not applying in this case. So you don't get people going around just at random saying lying is sometimes okay, everyone should lie if they feel like it. No, they say lying's bad, I'm not into lying. And they go, well, but in a scenario like what happened to me the other day, they say, da-da-da with a friend, I lied to a friend to spare their feelings. And the point is that I'm trying to make is that we add gray area and complication not because the situation requires it, but basically we try to carve out exceptions for ourselves. We try to make excuses why this time the moral rule doesn't apply to us, but then still maintain that there's generally a moral rule. Right? People don't say because there's gray area, there's no morality. What they say is there's gray areas and every situation is different. So when you're lying to me, I'm going to call you out and say, lying is wrong. You shouldn't have done that. But when I'm lying, I'll say maybe this is one of those gray area circumstances where it's not as bad as it seems. Remember, this is me accusing everyone of doing this, not Kant. So if anyone's a jerk here, it's me. Right? When we want an exception to the rule, it's usually because the politician we like would benefit if there's an exception to that rule. We would benefit. Something would be easier or more convenient for us. We don't do it for the sake of someone else or because morality is actually so complicated. It's that we want to force a technicality on morality. Ooh, that sounds good. A technicality on morality. Catch it in sort of a gotcha situation so that we can do something that deep down we know isn't great, but claim gray area, exception, etc. Okay. Now Kant says it slightly differently. You see these examples that he gives on page 37, and then he returns them on page 39. This is what Kant says about law, about morality being an obligation that you follow consistently, about morality applying to all people equally. Okay, this is what he says. He says, when we say that lying is wrong, but sometimes there's exceptions to it, we're sort of saying two things at once. And these two things do not fit well together. We're saying that there is a rule against lying, and then also that there isn't a rule against lying. We're saying that we think in general people should not lie, which basically means you should never lie. And then we're also saying, yeah, but sometimes you should lie. This is why Kant thinks that moral rules, just to be rules, not even like talking about practically applying them, but for a rule to be a rule, it either has to hold all the time or none of the time. Like gravity, gravity doesn't make any sense as a law of nature if 95% of the time it works. And then other times there's, quote, a gray area or something like that. So this is what he says. He says you can run this test to see if something's universalizable. He says, imagine what would happen if everyone acted the way you're acting. Okay? Now, if you're acting well, if you imagine that everyone acted in the same way, everything works smoothly, it works great, no contradictions, everyone's happy. But for instance, lying, if you said, what if someone lied every time it was more convenient for them to lie? What if someone lied every time they wanted to escape a difficulty or not hurt someone else's feelings, etc.? So what would happen if you made that moral and therefore universal? He says the whole thing would break down. If people could or did lie every time it felt easier for them, or if people could or did lie every time it would spare someone else's feelings, the entire concept of truth-telling and lying would break in half. There would be no access to the truth anymore because everyone would be lying some of the time and telling the truth some of the time, and you'd never be able to tell the difference. Okay? What Kant says is that morality is consistent and it can be applied the same way in every time. Just don't steal, just don't murder, just don't lie. If, though, we start carving out all these exceptions for ourselves, do but don't, do it all the time but do it sometimes, it makes chaos out of the world and the world would stop making sense. The more formal way to put this is that when you try to make a moral judgment, run this little test and see if you can, if it would make sense, if you would want it, that everyone in that similar situation would do the same thing. So every time someone's asked an uncomfortable question, they lie. Every time it would save someone a few bucks or be easier, they lie. What would the world look like then? It would look horrible. Literally, words would not mean what words mean. Nobody wants to live like that. Therefore, lying is morally wrong, because it would make a totally horrible world if that's what people did. Okay, so I'm going to end this recording here, and we're going to go to the other side of Kantian morality. This first side has been about reason, about being consistent, about law and obligation and duty, D-U-T-I, about consistent moral judgments. The next part will be about freedom, autonomy, all that sort of stuff. Okay, thank you, everyone.